Hello, welcome to PSR, another edition of People Speaking Rail. And just like a precision scheduled railroad, we start this precisely at 3 o'clock Eastern, 2 o'clock Central Time on Thursday afternoon. I'm one of your hosts, Mike Baudendistel. I'm the head of intermodal solutions here at FreightWaves, work primarily on the data side, joined with my colleague, Joanna Marsh, who does the writing on the editorial side of the railroads. Joanna, you've been really busy writing about the CP KCS merger.
Yeah, there's the what do you call it now? The final environmental impact statement came out on Friday, and that's kind of one of the last things that that needed to process through in order for the Surface Transportation Board to render its decision. I don't know when exactly they will issue the decision, but it could be fairly soon. So now that environmental impact statement is out there. So
yeah, I've heard
there's lots of,
maybe within the next month. Is that your understanding?
I'm sorry, what did you say?
Sometime within the next month or so. Is that your understanding of when they could issue a final ruling?
Possibly. I mean, yeah, possibly. I think I had read somewhere that it could be sometime within the next month, but it really is kind of. I think they do have a timetable out there. I'd have to go back and look and see what exactly is. So, they can't draw it out for too much longer. I mean, they can't, issue a decision in July or August. So it could be, within the next month. I know Canadian Pacific has said, or Keith Creel, the president and CEO of CP, has said that he has been anticipating a decision within the first quarter of this year. So, it could be, what is it, like early February? So we still got a little bit of time, but yeah. So now it's just the ball's in the STB's court to see what they decide.
Yeah. So you outline the EIS, this environmental impact study, in your article. And so this consists of a volume 1 that describes analysis and findings, which it was 401 pages on the STB site. It also includes a volume 2 that gathers relevant information to prepare the document. That's 4,880 pages. And there's also a volume 3 that summarizes and responds to the public comments. And that summary of the comments is 447 pages for a total of 5,728 pages. I trust you have fully read and digested all of that in preparation for your article.
Oh, of course, absolutely, yeah. As an aside, I think if anyone has insomnia, they can just kind of pick up a file and just start reading, and hopefully, I'm not to say that the merger is boring, but but 5,000 pages worth, it might be a bit much. So, and then if you actually do read through the whole thing and you find the birds chirping in the morning, then God bless you. So, so it's pretty exhaustive, and especially I think this. Not to say the past haven't met, but this particular Surface Transportation Board has been pretty thorough about looking at this merger and also just in general, just being kind of more meticulous, I guess. And you have the hearings that sort of start out as being a day or two, and then they kind of go on for 5 or 7 days or a month, as was the case with CSX, Norfolk Southern, and Pan Am. Oh no, sorry, not Pan Am. Sorry, let me say, and Amtrak. Excuse me, down in Louisiana and Alabama. So that was, I think, took over a month. But going back to CP KCS, that was a lot of material to go through. So. So I guess kudos to the Office of Environmental Analysis for compiling all of that.
And if we were to summarize the summary, essentially what the findings is that the EIS concluded that, quote, most of the potential adverse impacts of the merger, including impacts on grade crossing delays and emergency vehicles, would be negligible, minor, and or temporary. And then you go in to describe how that this would impact potentially adverse noise pollution. And it just sort of strikes me, you sort of put those two things together, that the noise pollution is something that can be mitigated. My understanding is that the railroads are under kind of these orders to not blow whistles in the middle of the night. If you're going through an urban area, they can do that sort of in a non, in the middle of nowhere, or they can do it during the daytime hours, but 3 o'clock in the morning, right next to a bunch of apartment buildings. They're not supposed to blow their horn and wake everyone up. It just seems like this deal isn't going to be held up because of noise pollution. And then it seemed like, for the most part, that the organization writing this was fairly satisfied with a lot of the mitigation measures that were going to be put into place, like the extending passing sidings. I think they referenced, 25 different locations along the combined network that would include adding double track. And so my conclusion is, if you weren't already confident that the Surface Transportation Board was going to approve this merger, you're more confident now. Did you have the same take?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, to have the noise pollution factor kind of reiterated as kind of the sole, or the big main finding from the environmental impact statement. So there was a draft statement that was published in October, I believe, and then you had all these public comments coming in from around that time. Probably, I think maybe before then, there was a public hearing on the merger as well, and so you had a lot of local communities coming in from Chicago and Houston, kind of talking about the effects of the merger, and then of course you had the Class 1 railroads kind of talking about how they felt about the merger, and so and so you have that as a backdrop, and then of course the Office of Environmental Analysis, gets back into its huddle and kind of works on the final version, and the final version still kind of comes out with the same conclusion in terms of the noise pollution. And I mean, I think that for I think Canadian Pacific, I'm not entirely sure like what specific remedies they have to address noise pollution, beyond I'm sure that there are remedies, and I'm sure that they're talking to local communities about it, but I think for that to be the main thing blocking the potential merger, I mean, I don't think, CP is going to do all that it can, now that's, gone like 90% of the way, to make sure that the merger happens, and try to do is, if they need to convince any more, the board members, or they're probably, I'm sure that's, the end of the race is near. And so, to quit now, it's just kind of, although that said, Canadian Pacific also had their quarterly earnings, and they did speak about the merger quite a bit, but it wasn't, in my opinion, the dialogue was kind of cautious in terms of like, well, let's wait and see what will happen. The analysts Wall Street analysts had asked questions about, what do you think the operating ratio will be with the two companies? Like, what sort of like revenue targets do you see with the two companies? So they're trying to figure out like what a merged company might look like financially, and the executives on the call kind of kept deflecting those questions and be like, well, we'll just wait and see. We can't say right now because the merger hasn't happened yet. So taking kind of that cautious stance.
Yeah, which I think is smart. I mean, I think it seems like most of the railroads have had less guidance than they typically would have, maybe in light of the economic situation, but also a lot of the cost pressures that they're seeing. We'll talk a little bit about that other article in a second here, but just one other thing that came up from some of your articles is it was interesting that the largest increase in traffic was supposedly going to be between Kansas City and Sabula, Iowa. I had to look up Sabula, Iowa. That's on the Mississippi River, just east of Cedar Rapids. And, that was part of I think the idea all along was to have fewer trains go on that part that Canadian National said that CP should have to divest, that goes through sort of central and southern Illinois through like Bloomington, Illinois, and because so that after the merger, more of those trains are going to be routed to that further northward route, going through Iowa onward to Chicago. But what was interesting also was that there's this quote that says, it was in the EIS that said, alternative, if the board were to deny the CP to acquire KCS under under that alternative, they anticipate that the rail traffic would only increase on the CP and KCS network as a result of general economic growth. So, and because they wouldn't have this sort of the planned capital investments that they would normally that they would have under the merger, because it sounds like they almost like they were getting out in front of requirements to add capital to the capital plan to support the merger. So I thought those things were interesting. Sort of further bolsters the thought that this is likely to be approved fairly quickly. And then the other thing I thought was interesting is I didn't see anything in your article, and I don't know if you saw it in the primary material much about Houston, which was, I think, a concern that some of the companies raised, that there would be just more congestion in Houston as a result of the deal. Did you see anything on that?
Yeah, they did mention Houston in the final statement, and I think the challenges with Houston is that while KCS does pass through the region, a lot of the network is actually operated by Union Pacific, and I believe BNSF is there's they fit in there somewhere somewhere as well, and so. You have so a lot of the issues that the communities raised were you can't just kind of isolate the KCS and sort of you kind of have to look at it with all the other rail activity that's going on there. And so I think that's kind of what they were saying. Although I guess it raised. It raised a flag in terms of, or sort of gave a spotlight, I should say, to the area, saying, this is potentially, something to look at later on in terms of, sort of environmental impacts. But like I said, it's not just KCS there. There's Union Pacific, and so it's just like, how do you mitigate those factors, with multiple rail lines?
Yeah, I think that's right. And so a lot to be worked out there. I want to move on and just talk a little bit about your other CP article. This one's called Canadian Pacific Ready to Roll on Kansas City Southern Merger. So this one, you go into talking about how there's been some tests with the interline basis. So you're talking about a temperature controlled train going from the Midwest to Laredo in 3 days. That'd be competitive with truckload. If you think about it, a truckload can go about 500 miles in a day. If you can do it on the rail in 3 days, you're probably competitive, depending on where in the Midwest you're located. And then also talked about some service sensitive products from the upper Midwest into Canada. That sounds to me like agriculture. And then you bring up a good point that CP is heavily weighted in the bulk side. Sort of 40% of the bulk of business is bulk. That would include things like grain, but also potash. Always sort of has been, was part of the reason years ago why they located the headquarters to Western Canada. And sort of all of those things, is that a case to be made that the revenue segment that's going to be most impacted is going to be sort of the bulk franchise, moving grain across border, or do you think maybe the bigger impact we're ultimately going to see would be more intermodal and automotive with the merger?
Right. I think if I was CP, I would say both. But yeah, I think obviously, on one hand you have bulk, the executives on the call the other day, it's kind of saying bulk has helped us through quarterly earnings and will find continued support from them in 2023. And so just the way that their business is constructed, there's just more bulk business, I guess. But I think, KCS or CP has always also been touting, the potential for those intermodal movements, or those like those refrigerated move, like the service, more service intensive moves, from to and from, Mexico, and through Chicago, and into Canada, and back again, and of course, the port that's on the west coast of Mexico. They also, I should know this, and I remember. They,
Lazaro Cardinal.
yeah, Lazaro. Because I'm like, I keep thinking Laredo, and I'm like, no, it's not Laredo, because Laredo's on the border. Yeah, they keep touting that as well, as a not to necessarily, take significant volumes from Southern California, but sort of as an alternative. So, but they have, CP and KCS have been kind of running test runs. I mentioned it in the fourth quarter earnings, but they also did mention it in prior earnings calls as well, at least I think in the third quarter. So they've been doing it for a while, and I think they're just kind of growing, their test runs, or just, yeah, so.
Yeah, I sort of agree, sort of all the above. I want to move on to this next article that you wrote. So this one called "Iowa Bill Seeks to Limit Length of Freight Trains." So you put this out Tuesday, January 31st. Legislation would restrict train speeds to 8,500 feet. And this seems to me like this could potentially be a pretty big deal if this were to go through the legislative process. Some trains as long as 3 miles, longer trains could not block crossings, et cetera. And it just seems like, well, it's an issue if you have one state in the middle of the country that has a restriction on the length of trains. That almost any trains going through there would have to comply with that, and you sort of worry, if you're the railroads, that all these different states would pass different laws about the different lengths of trains. With PSR, has been one of the big pushes, has been to elongate the trains to enhance cost efficiency. It was interesting that Ed Harris at Canadian National, this last earnings call, talked about shortening the trains in the idea of improving the customer experience. Just doing it according to a schedule, even if the train is not as long as it typically would be, almost reversing that trend. But I wanted to see if you had any other thoughts on, is it feasible for some states to just have all of these different laws, and it can all be just sort of piecemeal, that the trains are going to have to comply with almost the whoever has the regulation for the shortest train, if assuming that it goes through a number of states.
Yeah, I thought it was kind of that. I thought that was that was an interesting bill, as you had said, just because you hear about the bills for the train crew sizes having at least two crew members, sort of, in various states, and then of course you have the national regulation that's being considered by the Federal Railroad Administration. But to have a bill on train lengths, that was kind of intriguing. It kind of makes me wonder, just personally, like if that's if that is something that other states could take up as well, if you find someone who would be willing to draft legislation on that. I think partly, because of the merger between, the presumed merger between Canadian Pacific and Kansas City Southern, and you have, the traffic going through Iowa. There is that concern. Like, I think that kind of was one of the factors, perhaps, of why the bill was introduced. Although it was actually introduced, I think, in a prior legislative term as well. So, but that is interesting. That's kind of that's a state issue, and again, like, where will if it becomes a bigger issue, and if so, like, where will it, where will the state versus like federal, like
Mhm.
which one will
Mhm.
trump which, in terms of like, the cross-border, cross-state border commerce versus, state, which one will preempt which, I guess. So I don't know, we'll see what happens.
Yeah, because you wrote a similar article the other week. Was it about Ohio that they wanted to have some, say over, I guess, trains idling at crossings also, and it's probably for the same motivation that they
Yeah.
just don't want to have the crossings blocked to impair first responders and the like.
Yeah, yeah. I think, well, yeah, yeah, you're right. The crossings issue, and I guess, yeah, the longer trains is kind of just another way of going about it.
Mhm.
But yeah, the crossings issue. And then I think I need to check what's going on with it, on it. But there were those states that were, asking the Supreme Court to consider, the whether, states can regulate, rail crossings. And I'm not sure where. I think there's some sort of activity that's supposed to happen sometime in February. But
Mhm.
yeah, I mean, it's just it's funny because in a past life, when I had to cover freight rail for another company, we didn't really write about blocked crossings because that wasn't really, it was seen as more tangential to sort of freight rail issues. But
Mhm.
but it's just such a, um, there's just a lot of community momentum towards
Mhm.
addressing that, and then of course you have the trucking side of it that doesn't like block crossings either. So
Yeah, I don't think anyone does, but it'll be interesting to see how that all shakes out. So, I want to move on to the next topic here. Intermodal volume starts the year slowly. I think that's fair to say. The AAR data shows that January was intermodal's worst January in a decade. So yeah, I think it's fair to say pretty slow. Total volume, when you include sort of total unit volume, including rail car loads, intermodal units, and trailers, declined 3.2%. You sort of break that down. Car loads down 2.2% year over year in January. Intermodal units down 8.1% when you include both containers and trailers. And in Sonar, we can break that down in the various segments, have a chart on domestic intermodal there. So domestic intermodal actually hasn't been too bad. You sort of see, well, okay, yes, it's below where we were in 2022 and 2021. Those were coming off very strong peak seasons during those the prior falls. Really wasn't a peak season in 2022, which you can see in the green on the right there, how that sort of tailed off. And now we're kind of in line with 2020, February 2020. So we'll start to face easier comps. You go back to the 3-year comparison there, but certainly showing some slowness. There. Turning to the next one, the international intermodal container volume. This one has been weak for really a number of months. You sort of go back to, in green there in 2021, and that's really started to sort of fall off during, late 2021. During that period of time, there was more transloading from international containers into domestic containers. And then last year, it's fell off in the second half of the year, again with the decline in imports, and is still sort of weak, also kind of down mid-single digits on the international container side of things. So those would be your 40-foot containers and 20-foot containers. But really where the big weakness is, turning to this next Sonar chart, is the total intermodal trailers. Now, we all know this is a declining market, but this is really what's driving a lot of that, 8% and change weakness in January are the trailers. Those are down about 30% from last year, and this market saw signs of life in 2020. You see in orange was kind of a weird situation where truckload market tightened up. This was being impacted positively during the pandemic year, the worst of the pandemic year, when there was tight trucking capacity, especially sort of late in that year. You see in orange, but now trucking capacity loosened up. Not as much call for intermodal trailers, down 30%. So a big drop there, and I think just really reflects that there's looseness in the highway. Some of the articles we've talked about on FreightWaves have talked about how there's been the demand for truckload in January, maybe a little bit better than expectations, but those expectations were really low based on what we were seeing in January or not in November, December. Really didn't have a peak season there, either.
Mhm.
So with that as a little bit of what's happened in intermodal, want to ask you, Joanna, we have about 30 seconds left. What are you working on the next week that we have to look forward to?
Yeah, well, I think I will be working on, well, granted, BNSF via Berkshire half the way still has to release their fourth quarter results, but I think kind of looking at what sort of the big themes were from the earnings calls with the Class 1 railroads. They've all reported their results. And there's actually a lot of common themes throughout them all. That sort of economic uncertainty kind of being the backdrop of everything. So.
Great. Well, we'll look forward to that and see everyone next week on PSR.